She thought I smiled when those words left her mouth. Perhaps she misinterpreted the shock frozen on my face. "Go to the graveyard if you want." Sofia's voice echoed off the expensive silk curtains in the luxurious living room that my labor had furnished. Her new husband that Snob approved by swirling the expensive glass in his hand. My only daughter, the one I had dedicated my life to, was kicking me out of my own home while looking me straight in the eye. "Mother, don't you understand? You have no place here anymore. You're disrupting our lives." I looked at her. The cashmere dress she was wearing was bought with the money I saved for years. The watch on her wrist was bought with the money I got from selling my husband's last keepsake. I didn't say a single word. The silence of the room was filled with her arrogant breathing. I stood up. My 68-year-old bones ached under the weight of the betrayal. I felt I walked to my bedroom past the faded photographs on the wall. Sofia's first steps, her graduation. Every memory that caught my eye was like a shard of glass piercing my heart. My hands didn't tremble as I gathered the few belongings I could fit into a small bag. I was numb. This was a feeling deeper than anger. This was the coldest emptiness a mother could experience. I didn't look back as I walked out the door. "Where will you go at this hour?" She asked, a false concern in her voice, perhaps just trying to ease her own conscience. I didn't answer. The December frost cut through my thin coat as I walked toward the bus stop. I knew only one place to go, to the side of my husband Robert, whom I had lost years ago. The only place I had shared my grief for all these years. It was past midnight when I arrived at the cemetery on the outskirts of the city. The gate creaked open. The wind was howling. I walked towards Robert's grave, wanting to whisper to him, "What have we turned our daughter into?" But there, where the moonlight struck, something was wrong. Right next to my husband's grave, there was a freshly dug pile of earth and a new gleaming marble stone. I froze. Who was this? This was our family plot. It couldn't be anyone else. Trembling, I approached. I touched the cold stone wet with rain. My eyes tried to make out the dull letters, and I read it. Marilyn Johnson, beloved, mother and wife, 1957. My blood ran cold. That was my name. That was my birth year. But the death date was not blank. I collapsed to my knees, gasping. The date, it was carved with this current year. Sofía. She hadn't just kicked me out of the house. She had already declared me dead to seize my inheritance entirely. I understood it all in that moment. The luxury house, the expensive watches. It was all part of this plan. I looked at that cold marble, my own headstone. Sofía hadn't counted on one thing. Dead women can't talk, but I wasn't dead. Yet I sat there in the mud beside my own grave for what felt like hours. But the cold eventually forced me to move, because hypothermia doesn't care about your emotional breakdown, and I needed to think clearly now more than ever. My fingers were numb as I pulled out my old flip phone from my coat pocket, and the screen's pale light illuminated my face in that darkness surrounded by tombstones and the weight of betrayal that felt heavier than any coffin could ever be. I had $17 in my wallet and nowhere to go. But something inside me had shifted when I read my name on that marble stone, because the shock had transformed into something else entirely, and it wasn't grief anymore, but a cold, calculating anger that burned like ice in my chest. Sofía thought she had won by erasing me from existence, but she had made one critical mistake, and that mistake was assuming I would simply disappear quietly into the night without a fight. The cemetery gates were locked from the inside, so I had to climb over the low stone wall near the eastern corner, and my arthritis screamed in protest. But adrenaline is a powerful painkiller when you discover your own daughter has literally written your obituary before you're actually dead. I walked back toward the main road, where a single streetlight flickered like a dying firefly, and I needed to find shelter before dawn, because appearing publicly as a deceased woman could complicate everything I was about to do. The 24-hour diner on Maple Street was still open, and the fluorescent lights felt too bright after the cemetery darkness. But the warmth inside was a relief that made my frozen fingers tingle painfully as blood rushed back into them. The waitress was a young woman named Casey, according to her name tag, and she looked at me with concern that seemed genuine when she asked if I was all right, because I must have looked like someone who had literally crawled out of a grave, which wasn't far from the truth. If you thought about it symbolically, I ordered coffee and toast because that was all I could afford and still have money left for what I needed to do next, and Casey didn't charge me for the refills, which was a small kindness that almost made me cry. But I couldn't afford to break down now because tears were a luxury for people who had time to grieve, and I didn't have that luxury anymore. While I sat in that cracked vinyl booth, I started making a mental list of everything I knew about Sofia's plan, because understanding your enemy's strategy is the first step to dismantling it completely. First, there was the tombstone, which meant Sofia had already filed paperwork somewhere declaring me deceased, because you can't just order a headstone without death certificates and official documentation, and that level of fraud required connections, or money, or both. Second, there was the house, which was technically in my name, because I had inherited it from my mother and never transferred the deed to anyone else, despite Sofia's numerous requests over the past year that I had foolishly attributed to her, wanting to help manage my affairs, as she had put it so sweetly with that smile that I now realized was pure calculation. Third, there was my bank account, which I suddenly understood, with horrifying clarity, was probably already frozen or emptied. Because if Sofia had declared me legally dead, then she, as my sole heir and next of kin, would have access to everything I owned, including the $73,000 I had saved over decades of working double shifts and living frugally, so my daughter could have everything she wanted. The coffee turned bitter in my mouth, as I realized I had been funding my own erasure for years without even knowing it. But here's what Sofia didn't know, and this was going to be her downfall, because arrogance makes people sloppy, and she had gotten so confident in her scheme that she hadn't considered all the variables. I was still alive and breathing and sitting in a diner at 2 a.m, which meant I could prove she had committed fraud on a massive scale, because declaring a living person dead is a federal crime, and forgery of death certificates could land someone in prison for up to 15 years if I remembered correctly from that crime documentary I had watched last month. The problem was proving it without revealing myself too soon, because if Sofia knew I was alive and aware of her plan, she would adjust her strategy and cover her tracks, and possibly even accelerate whatever endgame she had planned for when my body was eventually supposed to be discovered. I needed evidence first, and then I needed allies, because taking down your own daughter in a legal battle requires more than just righteous anger, and a flip phone with 12% battery life remaining. Casey came by to refill my coffee again, and this time she sat down across from me in the booth without asking permission, which should have annoyed me, but instead felt comforting in a strange way, because human connection was something I desperately needed after being erased from existence by my own flesh and blood. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Casey said, and the irony of that statement almost made me laugh, because I was the ghost in this scenario, or at least I was supposed to be according to the marble tombstone with my name carved into it. She was maybe 25 years old, with purple streaks in her dark hair and a nose ring that caught the fluorescent light, and something about her reminded me of Sofia, before the greed had consumed her back, when my daughter still had warmth in her eyes and didn't look at me like I was an obstacle to be removed. "Something like that," I said carefully, because I couldn't tell this stranger the whole truth. But I also couldn't sit here in silence anymore, without my thoughts eating me alive from the inside out. Casey studied my face with an intensity that suggested she was used to reading people, which made sense given her profession, because waitresses see humanity at its worst during the late-night hours, when desperation and loneliness drive people into diners seeking comfort in coffee and pie. "My shift ends in 20 minutes, she said. checking the clock on the wall that was stuck permanently at 3:47, though the actual time was closer to 2:30 in the morning. There's a motel 2 blocks from here that's cheap and clean, and the owner Jerry owes me a favor, so I can probably get you a room for the night if you need somewhere to stay. And the kindness in her offer made something crack in my chest because strangers were showing me more compassion than my own daughter had. I wanted to refuse out of pride because I had spent my entire life being self-sufficient and not relying on anyone's charity. But pride is a luxury that homeless women with $17 can afford. So instead, I nodded and said, "Thank you," in a voice that came out smaller than I intended. Casey smiled and squeezed my hand across the table, and her fingers were warm against my cold skin, and for just a moment I let myself feel the comfort of human kindness before the armor went back up, because I couldn't afford to be vulnerable when I had a war to plan. True to her word, Casey finished her shift and walked me to the Starlight Motel, which had seen better days, probably sometime in the 1970s, based on the faded turquoise paint and the neon sign that only lit up the letters STR and TE, making it read as STRTE in flickering pink light. Jerry was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with kind eyes and a coffee stain on his shirt. And when Casey explained I needed a room without going into details, he just nodded and handed me a key to room 12 without asking for payment or identification, which was a blessing because I wasn't sure my ID would even work anymore if I was legally deceased. "Stay as long as you need," Jerry said, and the simplicity of that offer without conditions or questions made me realize that kindness still existed in the world, even if my own daughter had forgotten how to practice it. Casey walked me to the room and helped me inside, and the space was small but clean, with a bed that looked soft enough and a bathroom with running water, and in that moment, it felt like a palace compared to sleeping on cemetery ground next to my own tombstone. "I work most nights, if you need anything," Casey said, lingering in the doorway like she wanted to say more, but wasn't sure if she should, and I appreciated her restraint because I wasn't ready to share my story with anyone, yet not when I barely understood it myself. After she left, I locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had happened, because I was alone now, and the walls couldn't judge me for falling apart. I cried for maybe 10 minutes, which felt like an eternity and also like no time at all, and then I stopped, because crying wasn't going to change anything, and I had work to do if I wanted to reclaim my life from the daughter who had stolen it. I plugged in my phone to charge, using the outlet by the bed, and while it powered up, I went to the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror for the first time since leaving Sofia's house. And what I saw startled me, because I looked older than 68 in that moment, with my gray hair wild from the wind and my eyes red from crying and dirt smudged on my cheek from kneeling beside the grave. But beneath the exhaustion and the pain, I saw something else in my reflection, and it was determination, or maybe it was rage, or perhaps it was both mixed together into something new and dangerous, because a woman who has been declared dead has nothing left to lose, and that makes her more powerful than anyone realizes. I washed my face with cold water and tied my hair back, and when I looked in the mirror again, I saw not a victim, but a fighter. And that was the version of Marilyn Johnson who was going to take back everything that had been stolen from her. My phone had enough charge to make calls, so I started with the most important one, and I dialed my bank's 24-hour customer service line because I needed to know if my suspicions about my accounts were correct. The automated voice asked me to enter my account number, which I had memorized decades ago, and then it transferred me to a representative named Michael who sounded tired but professional, and I asked him to check the status of my checking and savings accounts. There was a pause and the sound of typing, and then Michael said, "Mom am showing both accounts as frozen pending estate settlement due to the account holder's death," and hearing those words spoken out loud made my stomach drop, even though I had expected them, because expecting something and experiencing it are two very different things. I asked him when the accounts had been frozen, and he said, "The death certificate was filed 3 days ago on December 18th, and the freeze was automatic per our policy." 3 days ago, which meant Sofía had been planning this for at least a week, because getting a fake death certificate requires time and coordination, and probably bribing someone at the county clerk's office, or wherever these documents get processed. I thanked Michael and hung up before he could ask any more questions, because I couldn't risk revealing I was alive, yet not until I had more evidence and a solid plan for how to use it. Next, I called my lawyer, Martin Webb, who had handled my will and estate planning 5 years ago, when I turned 63, and wanted everything organized in case something happened to me. Martin's office voicemail picked up because it was nearly 3 in the morning, but I left a message asking him to call me back urgently regarding a legal matter, and I kept my voice steady even though inside I was screaming, because my own daughter had essentially murdered me on paper while I was still breathing. I needed more information about how Sofía had pulled this off, so I did something I hadn't done in years, and I opened the Facebook app on my phone because even though I barely used social media, I had created an account years ago to keep up with Sofía's life when she stopped calling me regularly. Her profile was set to public because she loved showing off her lifestyle, and I scrolled through her recent posts with a sick fascination like watching a car crash in slow motion. 2 days ago, she had posted a photo of herself in black clothing with the caption, "Saying goodbye to my dear mother, who passed peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by love and family," and the post had 247 likes and dozens of comments offering condolences, and my hands shook so badly, I almost dropped the phone because she had announced my death to the world while I was still alive, and people believed her and were sending flowers and sympathy, and no one questioned it because why would they? I scrolled through the comments and saw names I recognized from years ago, including some of my old coworkers from the hospital where I had worked as a nurse for 30 years before retiring, and seeing their kind words about my passing made me want to scream because I wasn't dead, and they were mourning someone who was sitting in a motel room, very much alive, and plotting revenge. One comment stood out from a woman named Patricia Chen, who had been my supervisor, and she wrote, "Marilyn was the kindest soul I ever met, and she dedicated her entire life to her daughter, and now they're reunited in heaven." And the irony of that statement was almost funny, except nothing about this situation was funny at all. I took screenshots of everything I could find, including the Facebook post and the comments and the photos Sofía had shared of my alleged funeral arrangements, because all of this was evidence of her fraud, and I would need it later when I decided to rise from the dead, legally speaking. There were photos of flower arrangements and a closed casket at a funeral home I didn't recognize, and I wondered whose body was in that casket, or if it was empty, or if Sofía had somehow obtained a Jane Doe corpse to make her story more believable. The level of planning this required was staggering, and it made me realize I had underestimated my daughter's intelligence and her capacity for deception, because this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision, but rather a carefully orchestrated scheme that had probably been in the works for months or even years. I thought about all the times she had asked about my health and my insurance policies and my bank accounts, and how I had interpreted her questions as concern when they were actually reconnaissance for this elaborate con. My phone buzzed with a text message, and for a moment I thought it might be Sofía, until I realized she thought I was dead, and dead people don't receive text messages. It was from Casey the waitress, and she had somehow gotten my number, probably from when I had given it to Jerry at the motel desk, and her message said, "Are you okay? I know we just met, but I'm a good listener, if you need to talk," and something about her persistent kindness made me want to trust her. Even though trusting people hadn't worked out well for me recently, I texted back, "Okay, thank you for everything," because I didn't know what else to say, and I wasn't ready to involve anyone else in this mess when I didn't even know what my next move should be. But Casey responded immediately with, "Nobody who's okay ends up at a diner at 2 a.m. looking like their world just ended. So whenever you're ready, I'm here," and I saved her number in my phone because having an ally, even a stranger who worked at a diner, might be useful in the days ahead. I spent the rest of the night researching death certificate fraud on my phone, and what I learned was both terrifying and empowering, because the penalties for falsifying a death certificate are severe and include felony charges that carry mandatory prison time, especially when the fraud is committed for financial gain. Sofía wasn't just facing civil lawsuits for stealing my money, but actual criminal prosecution that could land her in federal prison for a decade or more. And the thought gave me a grim satisfaction that I wasn't proud of, but couldn't deny. The problem was proving she had done it, which required finding out who had signed the fake death certificate, because doctors and medical examiners don't just hand those out without seeing a body. Someone had to be complicit in this fraud, whether they were paid off or tricked, and I needed to find out who that person was, because they would be the weakest link in Sofia's chain of lies, and the most likely to crack under pressure and reveal the truth. As dawn broke through the thin curtains of room 12, I realized I needed to do something I had been avoiding, and that was going back to my house, because that's where the evidence would be, and Sofía was probably feeling confident enough after 3 days that she wouldn't expect anyone to come snooping. I still had my house key, because she hadn't thought to ask for it back when she kicked me out, and that was another mistake on her part, because arrogance makes people sloppy, and Sofía was getting sloppy. I waited until 8 a.m. and then called a cab, because I didn't have a car anymore since Sofía had convinced me to sell it last year, claiming I was too old to drive safely, when really, she just wanted to limit my independence and make me more dependent on her. The cab driver was a chatty older man named Frank, who wanted to talk about the weather and the traffic, and I let him because his mundane conversation was a welcome distraction from the chaos inside my head. When we pulled up to my house, or what used to be my house, I asked Frank to wait around the corner, because I didn't want anyone to see me arriving in case Sofía or her husband were home. I paid him with some of my dwindling cash and told him I'd only be 15 minutes, and he agreed to wait while listening to sports radio. And I walked toward the house with my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The neighborhood was quiet at this hour on a Thursday morning, with most people already at work, and the ones who weren't were probably inside drinking coffee and watching morning television, completely unaware that a dead woman was walking past their houses. I approached from the side yard, where the tall hedges gave me cover, and I could see into the kitchen window, and my breath caught when I saw Sofía sitting at the table I had bought 20 years ago, drinking from my favorite mug and laughing at something on her phone. She looked happy and relaxed, without a trace of guilt on her face, and I realized in that moment that my daughter wasn't just greedy, but genuinely didn't care that she had destroyed me, because to her, I was just an obstacle that had been successfully removed. And now, she could enjoy her inheritance without the inconvenience of having to take care of an aging mother. The realization hurt more than the betrayal itself, because I could forgive someone who felt remorse. But there was no remorse in Sofía's smile as she scrolled through her phone, probably reading more condolence messages from people who thought she was a grieving daughter. I used my key to unlock the back door as quietly as possible, and I slipped inside through the laundry room, which opened into the kitchen hallway, and I could hear Sofía's voice talking to someone on the phone saying, "Yes, the estate should be settled within 6 weeks, and then we can finally renovate this place the way we want," without her complaining about every little change, and the casual cruelty in her tone made my blood boil, but I forced myself to stay calm and focused on my mission. I needed documents, and I knew exactly where to find them, because Sofía had always been organized to the point of obsession, and she kept all her important papers in the home office that used to be Robert's study. I moved through the house like a ghost, which was fitting, considering I was supposed to be dead, and I was grateful for the thick carpet that muffled my footsteps as I climbed the stairs to the second floor where the office was located at the end of the hall. The door was closed, but not locked, and inside the room looked different from how I remembered it, because Sofía had already started redecorating with expensive furniture and artwork that probably cost more than I had earned in a year. Her laptop was open on the desk, and I was tempted to look through it, but I didn't know her password, and I couldn't risk triggering any security alerts. So instead, I focused on the filing cabinet in the corner, which had always been where she kept her most important documents. The filing cabinet was locked, but I knew where Sofía kept the key, because old habits die hard, and she had always hidden spare keys in the fake plant on the bookshelf since she was a teenager worried about losing things. Sure enough, the key was there, taped to the inside of the ceramic pot, and I unlocked the cabinet, and started going through the files with my hands shaking from adrenaline and fear of being caught. Because if Sofía came upstairs right now, I would have nowhere to hide and no explanation for being in a house I supposedly no longer lived in. The first file I found was labeled Estate Documents, and inside was a copy of my will, which I had written 5 years ago, leaving everything to Sofía because she was my only child, and I had assumed she would take care of things responsibly. There was also a life insurance policy I had forgotten about, worth $50,000, with Sofía listed as the beneficiary, and I realized she stood to gain over $300,000 from my death when you added up the house value and my savings and the insurance payout, and suddenly her motivation became crystal clear. But the most damning evidence was in a folder marked Personal, which contained a copy of my death certificate, and I pulled it out with trembling hands and examined it closely under the desk lamp. The certificate listed my cause of death as cardiac arrest and the date as December 18th, which was 3 days ago, and it was signed by a Dr. Richard Morrison, who I had never heard of, and whose medical license number was printed at the bottom of the page, along with an official-looking stamp from the county medical examiner's office. I took photos of every page with my phone, making sure to capture all the details, including Dr. Morrison's signature and license number, because this was the evidence I needed to prove Sofía's fraud. I also found bank statements showing she had already withdrawn $30,000 from my savings account the day after my supposed death, and there were emails printed out from the insurance company acknowledging her claim and promising payment within 4 weeks pending investigation, which meant I had about a month before she got that $50,000 and probably disappeared somewhere I couldn't find her. There was also something else in the folder that made my blood run cold, and it was a handwritten note on Sofía's personal stationery that said Phase 1, complete death certificate filed and accepted by all necessary agencies. Phase 2, in progress asset liquidation and transfer. Phase 3, pending final estate closure and relocation to Costa Rica. The note was dated 5 days ago, which meant she had written it before she even kicked me out of the house, and I realized she had been planning to get rid of me for weeks, if not months. I was so focused on reading the documents that I didn't hear the footsteps on the stairs until it was almost too late, and I quickly shoved everything back into the folders and closed the filing cabinet, just as I heard Sofía's voice in the hallway saying, "Let me grab my laptop. I need to show you the beach house listings." My heart was racing as I looked around frantically for somewhere to hide, and the only option was the closet in the corner, which I squeezed into just as the office door opened, and Sofía walked in, followed by her husband Marcus, who I had only met a handful of times before they kicked me out. Through the crack in the closet door, I could see them clearly, and Sofía was showing Marcus something on her laptop screen saying, "This one in Tamarindo is perfect, and it's only $2 million, which we can easily afford once all the estate money comes through." Marcus nodded and said, "What about the body? Did you take care of that?" Loose end, and my breath caught in my throat because what body were they talking about, and why did they need to take care of it? Sofía laughed and said, "Relax. Everything is handled, I told you. Richard took care of it, and nobody's going to question a cardiac arrest for a 68-year-old woman with no family except me to push for an autopsy." Marcus still looked nervous, and he said, "But what if someone sees her? What if she shows up somewhere?" And Sofía's response made my blood turn to ice because she said, "She won't, Marcus. I made sure of that. When I switched her heart medication last month, she should have been dead 2 weeks ago, but the old bat has a stronger constitution than I expected, so I had to accelerate the timeline." I pressed my hand over my mouth to keep from gasping out loud, because what I was hearing was beyond fraud and beyond theft. This was attempted murder, and Sofía had been trying to actually kill me by tampering with my medication. Everything suddenly made sense, including the dizzy spells I had been having for the past few weeks and the chest pains I had attributed to stress and aging, when really my own daughter had been slowly poisoning me, hoping I would die naturally so she could claim her inheritance without the mess of a fake death certificate. But something had gone wrong with her plan, and I hadn't died fast enough, so she had been forced to go with Plan B, which was declaring me dead anyway, and hoping I would either actually die soon or disappear somewhere remote where nobody would believe a confused old woman claiming to be someone who was officially deceased. The realization that my daughter was not just a thief but an actual murderer changed everything, because this wasn't just about money anymore. This was about survival and justice, and making sure Sofía paid for what she had tried to do. Marcus and Sofía continued talking about their Costa Rica plans and their renovation ideas and how they needed to sell my house quickly before anyone asked too many questions, and I stayed frozen in that closet, barely breathing, until they finally left the office and went back downstairs. I waited another 5 minutes to be safe, and then I carefully opened the closet door and crept back to the filing cabinet, because I needed more evidence, especially anything related to Dr. Richard Morrison, who had signed my fake death certificate and was apparently complicit in this whole scheme. I found what I was looking for in another folder, marked medical, and inside were copies of my prescription records from the past 6 months, and I could see where someone had altered the dosage information on my heart medication, changing it from the correct amount to something much higher that could cause fatal arrhythmia. There were also text messages printed out between Sofía and someone named Rick, discussing the timeline and making sure it looks natural, and I realized Rick must be Dr. Richard Morrison, and he wasn't just signing fake documents, but had been actively helping Sofía try to kill me. I took photos of everything I could find, and then I heard voices getting louder downstairs and realized they were coming back up, so I quickly closed the cabinet and locked it and put the key back in the fake plant, and looked for another way out because I couldn't risk going back through the hallway. The office had a window that opened onto the roof of the back porch, and it was a risky escape route, but it was my only option. So I quietly opened the window and climbed out onto the shingles, trying not to think about what would happen if I fell and broke my hip, because 68-year-old bones don't bounce back from falls the way younger bones do. I managed to climb down using the porch railing and the trellis that held my climbing roses, and I dropped into the backyard just as I heard Sofía's voice from the office window saying, I thought I closed that window, and I didn't wait to hear Marcus' response, because I was already running as fast as my old legs could carry me toward the side yard and the hedge line that would hide me from view. My heart was pounding, and my chest hurt, and I wondered if this was what a real heart attack felt like, or if it was just panic and adrenaline and the terror of almost being caught by my would-be murderer daughter. I made it back to where Frank was waiting in his cab, and I climbed in breathing hard, and he looked at me with concern, asking if I was all right, and I just said, Drive, please, just drive. And he did without asking questions, which I appreciated, because I didn't have the breath or the composure to explain what had just happened. I had him take me back to the Starlight Motel, and I paid him with almost the last of my cash and gave him a generous tip for waiting and not asking questions, and he told me to take care of myself in a way that suggested he knew something was very wrong, but was kind enough not to pry. Back in room 12, I locked the door and put the chain on and sat on the bed and tried to process everything I had learned, because the situation was so much worse than I had imagined when I first saw my tombstone in the cemetery. This wasn't just fraud and theft. This was attempted murder and conspiracy, and I was dealing with people who had already tried to kill me once and would probably try again if they knew I was still alive and gathering evidence against them. I needed help, and I needed it from someone I could trust, which was a short list, considering my daughter had just tried to murder me, and my only friend in the world right now was a 25-year-old waitress I had met 12 hours ago. But Casey had given me her number and told me I could call if I needed anything, and I was desperate enough to take her up on that offer, because facing this alone was no longer an option when the stakes had escalated from fraud to murder. I called Casey, and she answered on the second ring, sounding sleepy, because it was only 10 a.m. and she had worked until 3 a.m. and probably hadn't gotten much sleep. Marilyn, she said, and hearing someone say my name with warmth instead of contempt made me start crying again, which I hadn't meant to do, but the stress of everything had finally caught up with me. I need help, I managed to say between sobs, and Casey immediately snapped into focus, saying, Where are you? I'm coming right now? She showed up at the motel 20 minutes later with 2 coffees and a bag of donuts, and she sat with me on the bed while I told her everything from the tombstone to the fraud, to the attempted murder and the overheard conversation about tampering with my medication. I showed her all the photos I had taken and the Facebook posts and the death certificate, and Casey listened without interrupting until I was finished, and then she said something that surprised me, which was, "My uncle is a homicide detective with the city police, and I think you need to talk to him immediately." I hesitated because going to the police meant making this official, and there would be no turning back once I filed a report, but Casey squeezed my hand and said, "Marilyn, your daughter tried to kill you, and she's going to get away with it if you don't do something, and you have all the evidence right here on your phone, so let's use it before she figures out you're alive and destroys everything." She was right, of course, and I knew it, but the thought of sending my own daughter to prison made me feel sick, even after everything she had done, because mother's love doesn't just disappear, even when it should. Casey's uncle was named Detective James Rivera, and he agreed to meet us at a coffee shop away from the police station because he wanted to hear my story before deciding whether to make it an official investigation. He was in his 40s with graying hair and kind eyes that reminded me of Casey, and he listened intently while I went through everything again, showing him all the evidence I had gathered and the photos from the filing cabinet and the text messages between Sofía and Dr. Morrison. Detective Rivera took notes and asked clarifying questions, and when I finished, he sat back in his chair and let out a low whistle, saying, "Mrs. Johnson, this is one of the most brazen fraud and attempted murder cases I've seen in 20 years on the force, and if everything you're telling me is true, your daughter is looking at serious federal prison time." He explained that declaring someone dead for financial gain is a federal crime because it involves insurance fraud and bank fraud, and multiple agencies would be interested in prosecuting this case, especially since there was also attempted murder through medication tampering. But he also warned me that the investigation would take time, and I needed to stay hidden and safe, because once Sofía found out I was alive, she would either try to finish what she started, or she would flee the country with whatever money she had already stolen. Detective Rivera said he would start by verifying the death certificate with the county medical examiner's office and tracking down Dr. Richard Morrison to question him about his involvement, and he also wanted to get a warrant to search my house and Sofía's computer for additional evidence. I asked him how long this would take, and he said, "Best case scenario, we have enough to arrest her within a week. But these things can take months if she has good lawyers and decides to fight it, so you need to be prepared for a long battle." I nodded because I had already accepted that my life was never going to be the same after this, and winning meant not just surviving, but making sure Sofía faced consequences for what she had done. Casey offered to let me stay at her apartment while the investigation was underway, because she said the motel wasn't safe long-term, and I would need somewhere stable where Sofía couldn't find me if she came looking. I accepted her offer with gratitude that I couldn't adequately express, because this young woman who barely knew me was putting herself at risk to help a stranger, and that kind of selfless kindness was rare in a world where my own daughter had tried to kill me for money. Detective Rivera moved quickly, and within 2 days he had verified that my death certificate was fraudulent and that Dr. Richard Morrison's medical license had been suspended 3 years ago for insurance fraud, which meant he was already a known criminal who had sold fake death certificates before Morrison was arrested at his apartment, with boxes of blank death certificate forms and a laptop full of incriminating emails showing he had been running this scam for at least 5 years, selling fake death certificates to people who wanted to fake their deaths, or in Sofía's case, declare someone else dead for financial gain. Morrison immediately agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence, and he gave a full statement admitting that Sofía had paid him $15,000 to create my death certificate and backdate it to make it look like I had died of natural causes. He also confirmed that Sofía had told him she was going to help nature along with my medication. But Morrison claimed he thought she was joking, and he didn't realize she was serious about actually killing me, which I didn't believe for a second, but it didn't matter, because his testimony was still valuable evidence. With Morrison's cooperation, Detective Rivera was able to get a warrant to search my house and seize Sofía's computer and financial records, and when the police showed up at my door with the warrant, Sofía apparently went pale and asked, "Why are you searching for evidence about my dead mother?" And one of the officers said, "Because your dead mother filed a police report yesterday claiming you tried to murder her," and according to Rivera's later account, Sofía had looked like she was going to faint right there on the spot. They found everything I had photographed and more, including a journal where Sofía had detailed her entire plan, from the initial idea to tamper with my medication, to the fake death certificate, to the timeline for selling the house and moving to Costa Rica. She had written everything down in meticulous detail, like she was planning a vacation instead of a murder. And the journal entries showed a complete lack of empathy or guilt that the forensic psychologist later said was consistent with sociopathic personality disorder. Marcus was arrested as an accomplice, since the text messages and the overheard conversation I had recorded on my phone proved he was aware of the plan and had helped Sofía execute it, and both of them were charged with attempted murder, conspiracy to commit fraud, insurance fraud, bank fraud, and about a dozen other crimes that Detective Rivera said would likely result in 15 to 25 years in prison if they were convicted. The hardest part was going to court and testifying against my own daughter. Because even though I knew she had tried to kill me, there was still a part of me that remembered the little girl who used to hold my hand and call me mommy, and tell me she loved me before bed every night. But that little girl was gone and had been replaced by someone I didn't recognize, and I had to accept that the Sofía I loved had probably never really existed or had been corrupted by greed and entitlement into someone capable of murder. The trial took 3 months, and it was covered extensively by local news because the story of a daughter trying to murder her mother for inheritance money was sensational enough to attract media attention. And I had to endure reporters camping outside Casey's apartment and photographers trying to get pictures of the ghost mother who had risen from her own grave to expose her daughters. Crimes, I hated the attention, but Detective Rivera said it was actually helpful because public pressure made it harder for Sofía's lawyers to negotiate a plea deal, and the prosecutors were determined to make an example of her. Sofía's defense tried to argue that she had been under financial stress and had made poor decisions, but the evidence against her was overwhelming, especially Morrison's testimony and the journal and the medication tampering that had been verified by forensic analysis. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding her guilty on all counts, and the judge sentenced her to 22 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for at least 15 years. Marcus got 18 years for his role as an accomplice, and Morrison got 12 years despite his cooperation, because the judge said anyone who sells fake death certificates for profit deserves significant prison time regardless of their willingness to testify against co-conspirators. The courtroom was packed when the sentences were handed down, and I sat in the back row with Casey holding my hand, and I felt nothing when they led Sofía away in handcuffs, because all the love I had once felt for her had been replaced by a hollow emptiness that I knew would never fully heal. After the trial, I had to rebuild my life from scratch, because even though I had legally been declared alive again, the process of undoing all the damage Sofía had caused took months of paperwork and legal filings and dealing with bureaucrats who couldn't understand how someone could be declared dead and then alive again. My bank accounts were eventually restored, and I got my house back after the court ordered Sofía to forfeit all the assets she had stolen, and I even received the $50,000 from my life insurance policy as compensation for the fraud. Though that felt darkly ironic given the circumstances, Casey became my unofficial daughter in the way that really matters, which is through choice and love rather than biology. And she moved into my house with me because she said living in that tiny apartment above the diner was depressing, and she wanted to help me renovate the place and make it feel like home again. We painted the walls and bought new furniture and got rid of everything that reminded me of Sofía, because I needed to start fresh without the ghost of my biological daughter haunting every room. Detective Rivera stayed in touch, and he told me that Sofía had tried to appeal her sentence, claiming she had been wrongly convicted. But the appeal was denied because the evidence was too strong and there was no procedural error that would justify overturning the verdict. He also told me that Marcus had filed for divorce from prison and was trying to cooperate with prosecutors on other cases to reduce his sentence, which I found grimly satisfying because their partnership in crime had fallen apart just like their marriage. I started volunteering at a local community center, teaching other elderly people about financial literacy and how to protect themselves from elder abuse and fraud, because I didn't want anyone else to go through what I had experienced. My story made me somewhat well known in certain circles, and I got invited to speak at conferences and workshops about the warning signs of financial exploitation and how to rebuild your life after betrayal by family members. It's been 2 years since I found my own tombstone in that cemetery, and my life now is nothing like what it was before. But in many ways, it's better, because I'm surrounded by people who genuinely care about me rather than people who see me as an obstacle or a source of money. Casey and I have movie nights every Friday, and we cook elaborate meals together on Sundays, and she introduced me to her friends who treat me like an honorary grandmother and include me in their lives in ways that make me feel valued and loved. I still think about Sofía sometimes, especially late at night when I can't sleep, and I wonder if she ever feels remorse for what she tried to do, or if she still believes she was justified in trying to kill me for inheritance money. Part of me hopes she's suffering in prison, and part of me hopes she's found some way to reflect on her choices and become a better person, though I know that's probably unrealistic, given her personality disorder diagnosis. The cemetery where I found my tombstone has become a strange sort of sanctuary for me, and I visit Robert's grave regularly to talk to him about everything that's happened, and sometimes I laugh about the absurdity of having to dig up my own fake grave marker and replace it with nothing, because I'm not dead yet and hopefully won't be for many more years. The groundskeeper knows my story, and he treats me with a mixture of awe and sympathy, like I'm some kind of undead legend, which I suppose I am in a way. Detective Rivera retired last year, and he told me that my case was the most memorable of his entire career, and he was glad he could help me get justice, even though the process was painful and complicated and required me to confront the worst aspects of human nature, including the capacity for a child to betray their parent in the most fundamental way possible. He comes to our Sunday dinners sometimes, and he and Casey have a special bond, because she's the one who brought us together and set everything in motion that led to Sofía's arrest. Looking back, I realized that finding my own tombstone was the best thing that could have happened, because if I had simply disappeared like Sofía planned, I would have died alone and forgotten, with no one to question the story she told about my death, and she would have gotten away with murder and lived a comfortable life on money, stolen from the mother she killed. Instead, I'm alive and she's in prison, and I've built a new family based on love and mutual respect, rather than obligation and blood ties, and that feels like the truest form of justice, even if it came at a terrible cost. 5 years have passed since that December night when I stood shivering in front of my own grave, and my life has transformed in ways I never could have imagined back when I was that broken woman with $17 in her wallet and nowhere to go. Casey got married last spring to a wonderful man named David who works as a pediatric nurse, and I walked her down the aisle because her own father had abandoned her family when she was 12, and she said I was more of a parent to her than he ever was, and I cried through the entire ceremony with a happiness I thought I'd never feel again. They're expecting their first child in 3 months, and Casey has already told me she wants to name the baby Marilyn if it's a girl, because she says I gave her a second chance at having a mother, and she wants to honor that by passing my name to the next generation. I've started knitting baby blankets and buying tiny clothes and preparing the guest room as a nursery for when they visit, because even though they have their own apartment, they come over so often that it makes sense to have a space ready for the baby here too. Detective Rivera's retirement party was held at my house, because he said after everything we'd been through together, it felt right to celebrate surrounded by the people who mattered most, and his wife thanked me for giving her husband a case that reminded him why he became a cop in the first place. We stay in touch through weekly phone calls where we discuss everything from crime documentaries to gardening tips, and he's become like the brother I never had, which is fitting, since Casey is like the daughter I should have had. If biology had been kinder to me, I received a letter from Sofía 6 months ago, forwarded through her prison lawyer, and I debated for weeks whether to open it because I wasn't sure I wanted to hear anything she had to say after all this time. Eventually, curiosity won, and I opened the envelope to find 3 handwritten pages that started with the words, "I don't expect you to forgive me," which was probably the most honest thing she'd ever said to me. She wrote that prison had given her time to reflect, and she'd been diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder and was receiving therapy and medication, and she claimed she finally understood the magnitude of what she'd tried to do, though. I'm not sure. I believe that people like her are capable of genuine remorse, or if they just learn to fake it better. The letter asked if I would consider visiting her someday, not because she deserved it, but because she wanted to apologize in person and try to explain how she became the person who could plan her own mother's murder as casually as planning a vacation. I haven't responded to the letter, and I'm not sure I ever will, because some betrayals are too deep to forgive, and I've built a good life without her in it, and reopening that wound might destroy the peace I've finally found. Casey thinks I should go just once to get closure, but Detective Rivera says closure is overrated, and sometimes the best thing you can do is move forward without looking back, and I'm inclined to agree with him. My volunteer work at the community center has expanded into a nonprofit organization called Second Chances that helps elderly victims of financial abuse and family exploitation navigate the legal system and rebuild their lives, and we've helped over 200 people. In the past 3 years, I partnered with a lawyer named Jennifer, who specializes in elder law, and together, we offer free consultations and support groups, and we've successfully prosecuted 17 cases of elder abuse that might have gone unreported if the victims hadn't found our organization and realized they weren't alone. The house is filled with life now. In a way it never was when Sofía lived here, because back then, it was just a showcase for expensive things she'd bought with my money. Whereas now it's a home where people gather and laugh and share meals and create memories that matter. We host a weekly dinner every Sunday that's open to anyone in the neighborhood who wants to come. And sometimes we have 5 people, and sometimes we have 20. But it's always loud and chaotic and wonderful, and exactly what a home should be. I still visit Robert's grave every month, and I tell him about everything that's happened. And sometimes I laugh, imagining what he'd say about his daughter trying to murder me and ending up in federal prison because he always said Sofía was going to be trouble when she started demanding designer clothes at age 13. But I thought it was just typical teenage rebellion and not a preview of the person she'd become. I've made peace with the fact that I'll never understand how we created someone capable of such calculated cruelty. Because genetics and upbringing can only explain so much, and sometimes people are just broken in ways that can't be fixed. The tombstone with my name on it was removed from the cemetery years ago, but I kept it, and it's now in my basement leaning against the wall as a reminder of how close I came to actually being dead and how precious life is even when it's messy and complicated and full of betrayal. Sometimes, when I'm having a bad day, I go down there and look at that marble stone with my name carved into it, and I think about how I could have let Sofía win by giving up, or disappearing, or actually dying like she planned, but instead, I fought back and reclaimed my life and built something better than what I had before. Casey's baby is due in exactly 73 days, and I've already bought enough toys and books and stuffed animals to fill an entire room, and she teases me about spoiling my grandchild before it's even born. But I don't care because this baby represents hope and renewal, and proof that families aren't defined by blood, but by love and choice and commitment. I'm going to be the best grandmother I can be, and I'm going to make sure this child grows up, knowing that real love means sacrifice and protection, and putting someone else's needs before your own, which is something Sofía never learned despite everything I tried to teach her. Last week, I got an email from a documentary filmmaker who wants to make a movie about my story, and am considering it because I think people need to understand that elder abuse is more common than anyone realizes, and it's often perpetrated by the people who are supposed to care for us the most. The filmmaker said she wants to call it The Woman Who Rose from Her Own Grave, which is a bit dramatic, but also accurate, And if my story can help even one person recognize the warning signs of financial exploitation or family betrayal, then it will be worth reliving the pain of everything that happened. I'm 73 years old now, and I've lived through more in the past 5 years than most people experience in a lifetime. And I've learned that survival isn't just about staying alive, but about finding reasons to keep living even when everything seems hopeless. I've learned that family is a choice, not an obligation, and the people who choose to love you are often more loyal than the ones who are supposed to love you by default. I've learned that justice takes time and patience, and sometimes it doesn't feel satisfying even when you win, because the cost of betrayal leaves scars that never fully heal. But most importantly, I've learned that it's possible to rebuild after everything falls apart and create something beautiful from the ashes of what was destroyed, and that's exactly what I've done with my second chance at life. Every morning, I wake up in my house surrounded by photos of people who genuinely care about me, and every night I go to sleep grateful that I'm still here to see another day, and that's more than Sofía ever intended for me to have. The future feels bright in a way it hasn't since Robert died all those years ago, and I'm looking forward to meeting Casey's baby and watching her grow up and maybe someday telling her the story of how her grandmother, Casey, saved a woman from her own daughter's murderous plot and gave her a reason to keep fighting. It's a dark story with a happy ending, which is the best kind, because it proves that even in our darkest moments, there's always hope if we're brave enough to reach for it. And if I've learned anything from finding my own tombstone in that cemetery 5 years ago, it's that being declared dead isn't the end of your story unless you let it be. And I refused to let Sofía write my ending, because I'm the author of my own life and am not finished writing yet.